the best fantasy city, one to rule them all. Is it Minas Tirith? No. Maybe Waterdeep? I don't think so. Is it Bowerstone? Good, but not good enough. Novigrad? Oh, it's great, but still not there. Kamor? That one's amazing, but even Kamor can't begin to compare to. Poets have tried to describe Ankh-Morpork. They have failed. Perhaps it's the sheer zestful vitality of the place, or maybe it's just that a city with 1 million inhabitants and no sewers is rather robust for poets who prefer daffodils, no wonder. So let's just say that Ankh-Morpork is as full of life as an old cheese on a hot day, as loud as a curse in a cathedral, as bright as an oil slick, as colourful as a bruise, and as full of activity, industry, bustle, and sheer exuberant busyness as a dead dog on a termite mound. Rating cities can be hard. They are places of contradictions. So what tips can the greatest city in all fantasy give us? World building is not a skill that you can improve by just reading or playing or watching. You must try your hand, you must explore, you must create. And this is the whole point of this series here, the Worldbuilding Tower. Together we analyze lovely, incredible, fantastic pieces of world building that exist out there in pop media, and from those I extract an exercise that any creator can use to improve their own craft. You can use it. And at the very end of the episode, I present my own take on this exercise, just as one possible example out of infinite. Today we're going to talk about fictional cities, but one tiny piece of context before we start. I'm a big city boy. I was born and raised in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a city with over 6 million inhabitants. A city so big, so wide, that if you want to cross it from one corner to the other with no traffic whatsoever, you might still take over 2 hours. That's my natural habitat, the dirty corners, the constant chatter, the low sounds from the underground. So, even though I love reading about the vastness of Lothlorien or the coziness of the Gryffindor common room, I have myself a special connection with cities. And we're gonna get there. We're gonna get to the most intoxicating city in all fantasy literature. Incidentally, both for the readers and also the characters. But first, let's talk about depicting cities, which can be pretty hard. Big cities are places of multiplicity. They're not just one thing, but a crazy amalgamation of many things, all interacting at once. So fictional cities must reflect that in their architecture and laws and districts, and above all in the diversity of its inhabitants, their desires and jobs and appearances and tribes. But at the same time, big cities have a vibe, some shared culture that permeates and sort of frames all of that diversity. New York has a vibe, Tokyo has a vibe, Paris has a vibe, this invisible connective tissue that informs a lot of the cultural and emotional landscapes. And those two elements, though existing in real life, are what makes writing urban spaces so complicated. How to create this overall vibe while also allowing radical multiplicity? No easy feat. Before we get to the queen of all fantasy cities, let me give you another good example. Scott Lynch's Kamor, the city we explore in the Lies of Loch Lamora. This book's plot and main cast are remarkably well suited to show us the diversity of the place. As the crew of thieves disguise themselves as different members of different segments of society, we get to see the streets and the shops and the noble salons and the temples and the harbor. Big places, small places, powerful people, powerless people. We get to see them all. And still, Kamor has a vibe, this Venice-inspired city of merchants and noblemen and crooks, the decadent beauty of it all. If you're writing a story around the city, I would definitely recommend Locke Lamora as a reference. But, even that being a great way to show a city, here's Kamor's limitation. We get to see all of those urban spaces, big and small, private and public, through one single lens, one perspective. We see the temple steps, or the nobleman's boat, or the crime lord's hideout from the perspective of characters with one objective in mind. In one scene, they're looking for clues. In another, they're considering jumping out of the window. In a third one, they're trying to bullshit someone. Those objectives guide what they're paying attention to, and thus what we get to see as readers. What if we could transcend that? Hence, Ankh-Morpork, Pearl of Cities. This is not a completely accurate description, of course. It was not round and shiny. But even its worst enemies would agree that if you had to liken Ankh-Morpork to anything, that it might as well be a piece of rubbish, covered with the diseased secretions of a dying mollusk. Ankh-Morpork, the biggest metropolis of the Discworld, has the most visceral vibe and the most vibrant diversity in all of fantasy literature. Fight me! This is the hill I die on. And it does that by using similar narrative tools to Kamor, the ones I just described, but with one crucial difference. Ankh-Morpork is a constant in the Discworld books. Sometimes the city is almost a main character, and sometimes it is only briefly mentioned, but it's always there. This is a story about a geological pizza balanced on top of 4 elephants that are themselves balanced on top of a giant turtle swimming through space. This world happens to be inhabited by creatures, but make no mistake, this is a story about the world. And the Discworld series doesn't really follow the particular journey of one character or group. They diversify. Sometimes we get the same cast of characters from a previous book, but sometimes we get a completely new one. So we get to experience the city from, oh, so many perspectives. For example, when we're following the adventures of the Night Watch, we get to see the life on the streets and the guilds of Ankh-Morpork. By contrast, other stories have their plots happening, for instance, inside the library of the Unseen University, a very narrow place in the city. Eventually, Corporal Carrot of the Night Watch goes to the library, and we get to see how he experiences the place. Eventually, very, very often actually, the librarian, who happens to be an orangutan, goes to the streets and guilds of Ankh-Morpork, and we get to see how he experiences them. By clashing those points of view, you start to create a sort of a 3D image of the city, and I'm not only talking about the geography and landscape, but also a 3D emotional image of the city, because what those characters pay attention to is vastly different. But because they end up inhabiting the same spaces, and because we get to know those characters very well, we end up with this rich image of the city and its many intricacies. I just mentioned 2 colliding points of view here as an example, but this is not a series of books about those characters. This is a series of books about that world. So imagine that, but with 100 extraordinary places to explore in Ankh-Morpork, and 100 lovable characters, who, eventually, all end up in the same bar, drinking the same stale beer. Can we extract a lesson from this wondrous place? Can we also have this prismatic lens that will show the different sides of our own fantasy cities? As we've seen, Ankh-Morpork is built by those thousands of interactions between characters and places. This expands over time, and in this case in over 40 plus books. But there's no point in telling you to just write a lot. we want to write will. So here's my proposal. Let's try to nail one of those three-dimensional interactions. And if we manage to nail this one, then we just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until we reach 1,000. So to start off, we need an urban space. Something very city-bound, not something that you could find in a village or the countryside. It can be a fantastical location, it can be a sci-fi location, as long as it reeks of city life. Then we need two factions, two groups. But we don't want them to be opposite forces. We don't want the rich and the poor, or the atheists and the priests. We want asymmetrical factions. We want people who see the world through an entirely different lens. The chess enthusiasts and the vegetarians. The captain of the pirate ship and the sentient mountain. We want factions that don't necessarily interact or even know about each other at all. Because we're going to explore this one location through both their lenses. We're going to tell a little story, a little tale about them interacting with this space, and hopefully at the end of it, we will have found a new level of nuance about that part of the city. Define location, define the factions, then tell a little story about how those factions interact with the location. Okay? And with that, we go to the last part of the video, which is my take on this exercise, and I invite you to write your own take in the YouTube comments below. You will see there's a lot of people commenting and everybody else's stories. This is such a lovely interaction, and I hope to see you over there. But for now, let's make a city. Right, city people, our time has finally come. Let's manufacture an urban legend. The location I'm going to choose is the city's apothecary, the potion shop. But I'm not talking about some small villager's hut with herbs and glass vials. I'm talking about a full building, narrow but 4 stories high. The ground floor is the colorful shop front, while the real magic, the brewing, the experiments happen in the upper stories. From the building's many chimneys you can see puffs of green and blue and pink smoke mixing in the air. The two asymmetrical factions I'm gonna choose here will be first the Guild of Shoemakers, and second the city's birds, more specifically the crows. So let's talk about their relationship with the apothecary in 2 little tales, starting with the shoemakers. Like any other shoemaker's apprentice, from time to time FIFA would have an apothecary assignment. It always made him nervous, not because it was particularly complicated, but because screwing up meant an immediate expulsion from the guild and the craft altogether, even though the task had nothing to do with laces and leather. He carefully entered the crammed shop, making sure his wooden cart wouldn't break any of the hundreds of glass bottles with glowing liquids inside. The shop emitted an eerie light of its own. The shopkeeper, Mr. Zicht, looked at the boy's face, then at the cart, and finally at his shoes. "Ah," he exclaimed, and turned back to pick up a package. The large bundle was meticulously wrapped in thick cloth. FIFO had a suspicion that the wrapping was less about protecting the potions inside and more about hiding their identity. From the apothecary, FIFO would now pass by each of the larger shoe workshops in the city, delivering 1 square bottle of the pink liquid to each of them before returning to his own shop. Love potions. Not applied in wine drinks like one normally would, but instead sprayed across the displayed shoes, attracting lustful regards. The boy chuckled as he rolled the heavy bundle through the cobblestone streets. The nice leather smell the customers were always mentioning. Nothing but drugs. More than once, FIFO had witnessed patrons who looked like they wanted to make love to one boot or another. Okay, so that was one of our factions. We got to see a little bit of the shop and also what sort of service an apothecary can provide to a city big enough to have many shoe stores. Now let's go for something completely different. People thought the smells of the apothecary attracted crows, but that was a misunderstanding. The noxious fumes pouring from the strange chimneys were foul to any bird.
including the black creatures nesting around the roof tiles, who were in a constant state of coughing, tearing up, and feeling like they'd soon vomit their last meal. The fact of the matter was that Crow society was all about showing off. "Oh, you think you're so fancy, with that nest just a couple of tiles away from the blue smoke chimney that smells like dead rats washed with cheap soap, huh? Huh, James?" thought one of the crows. "Well, my nest is just next to the big orange fumes that smells like an anglerfish farted a rotten coconut. I win." All in all, the arrangement was inconvenient to all involved. The crows had the means to make their lives almost unbearable, and the apothecary's apprentices spent approximately 1/3 of their time cleaning black feathers and white droppings.
So that's a new angle on the whole thing. It first ignores the ground level and the economics we were interacting with before, and it introduces this new part of the same urban space, which is the roof. And through this lens of a bird social psychology, kinda invites me to go back to the first scene and mention the black feathers on the floor. In the end, we learned a little bit about the economics of the city and the fauna of the city and how power dynamics work. We also opened the door for a scene with a grumpy crow interacting with a greedy shoemaker, perhaps even being accidentally sprayed by a love potion. There's also this subtle hint that all crafts will have masters and also apprentices doing unpleasant tasks. So we got to know this place a little bit better. Now, we just repeat this 999 times. And with that, I leave you for today. Thank you so much for your attention. A special thank you to the artists that contributed illustrations for this episode. You will find all of the links to the Artstation pages below. Follow them because their work is amazing. You've only seen a little bit of their work here. I promise you, if you click those links, you'll find so much more. Oh, what a treasure to have these people collaborating with me. Thank you so much, folks, for allowing me to use those illustrations. And another special thank you to my patrons. Oh my god, you're the best. Thank you so much for supporting me when a couple of weeks ago I told everyone that I had caught the plague. You were incredibly supportive. Oh, makes me want to weep. Thank you so much for being who you are. And I really like making this a video about the Discworld. Maybe I should make some more. I've been thinking about this. Anyway, I'll see you folks next time. Ciao.